you're rebuilding a two-stroke, now this is going in a Snowmobile, Polaris 800 HO, but I'm talking chainsaws, anything two-stroke. Get yourself one of these cheap little Dremel and some Amazon die bits, and just clean up your pistons. I mean, look at all these casting lines. Any squared off edges are a weak point, and also restrict a flow. You know, I'm not going to make a video on how a two-stroke works, but basically the piston works as an air pump to send air and fuel up into the cylinder, the combustion chamber, and then as the piston comes up, it compresses it and it fires off. So any of these 90-degree corners, sharp edges, like I said, not only is a 90-degree corner a weak point, it also restricts the airflow for when this air fills up the crankcase, piston comes down, air has to go down out of this piston into your transfer ports and then up into the chamber. So I just started working on this one, but I mean, this is pretty much all I'm going to do to this one, but just smoothing out those edges. Another thing, these corners, I mean, these are sharp edges from the factory, and this is the newest version of this SPI piston, and you got sharp edges everywhere, and you know, the piston, especially the bottom, it's rocking in the cylinder as it goes up and down. Your rings are up here, so taking away any of them sharp edges, it can get caught on ports, is something you need to do. Now after I'm done with that one over there, I'll take this one. I just take a piece of emery cloth by hand and just further smooth these out, and I'll also smooth out these top edges. They do put a little bit of a bevel on there, but just round that off a little bit, because remember, your rings are doing the work of the compression, go in these grooves. So having the top of this piston, especially for that exhaust port, that it's not going to catch on anything. And I'll pull the cylinder out here in a minute, or the monoblock in this case, and I'll show you what I did there. Once again, this is already a performance engine. It's in a Snowmobile, so they do a pretty good job with smoothing out the ports, but I'll show you what I do just for longevity. I mean, these aren't necessarily big performance gainers, but for longevity and just increasing that airflow a little bit. I'll see down in there, I have some pitting from where I dyed it. I'll take one of these stones and smooth those out a little more. And you're not trying to take away a bunch of material. I mean, it's there for a reason, right? It's for supporting the piston, but that's what I started with. And then I just smooth all that out, and I'm gonna go clear down that ridge and smooth it out. All right, and then I do bevel these with the tool before I smooth it out with emery by hand. Another thing here is I have this little scale. So here's factory piston, about 445 grams, and they are pretty even. I think the other factory one, well, let's just look, I think it's 4. It has the rings on it, so it's not going to be exact, but the one I finished, sorry, here's the finished one, about 447. Now these are a little heavier than the stock. It's probably because they have a little more support in them, but just by smoothing those out, I'm taking out 3 or 4 grams. And you got to remember, these things are spinning close to 9,000 RPMs going up and down, so it's moving fast. So the lighter you can get them without taking away support, the better off you are. All right, so I got this one about halfway done. As you can see, I mean, it took me probably 3 minutes. Just do real light strokes. I use this one. I mean, this is my go-to. And then you get down in some of them corners where you see I didn't get it all the way cleaned up. Then I'll go down to a smaller tip. But remember, we're trying to keep those radiuses as big as possible. So you don't want to start with the small one and then gouge into the material. But up here on these edges, all I did there was knock out some of the, see those casting dimples? So all I did was knock those down. We're not taking out a bunch of material. We're just smoothing everything out, taking out any right corners, sharp edges, things like that. I also knocked out all those casting lines that were in there. I'll clean those up a little more, and then we'll hit them with the stone, smooth it out. I'm not gonna get into porting theory or any of that stuff. If you wanna do that, go to Tin Man saws or Iron Horse saws. Those guys know what they're talking about when it comes to porting and doing all this stuff. This for me is just kind of something you wanna do. Why not? Takes 15 minutes and helps longevity and a little bit of performance. But you do want to leave these surfaces rough, and that's just so that the fuel and air stays atomized while it's in here. If it's super smooth, your fuel, and in this case oil being a 2-stroke, will puddle up on the surfaces, and you're not getting the combustion out of it. Now this side, that's a pretty deep groove. And like I said, we're not trying to hog off a bunch of material. We're just smoothing out these edges. So it's a lot deeper than this side. So I'm just smoothing, putting a chamfer on this corner, and then slowly kind of rounding it off. All right, got the majority of it done. Now I'm just going to set the chamfers on the outside. All right, so this one I did first. And I probably did a little more work to it, but let's just see where we sit as far as weight goes, because especially if you're not just trying to reduce weight, you definitely want them to be even on a 2-cylinder engine. So 446.9, let's do that one again. 46.8. 449. So we definitely need to do some more work to this second one, and that's what we're gonna do. All right, so with the stone, just going around all the spots I hit and more or less deburring and smoothing out if I made any gouges or spots that are a little bit deeper or kicked up any burrs. That's what I'm getting rid of. All right, then lastly, I'm gonna take a little piece of 320, go around all the edges. You're even gonna hit these little sharp corners here. As you can see, you're just knocking that edge off. That's just one less thing to snag on the cylinder. I'm also going to do this top edge. Make sure there's no burrs or little nicks in it. Like I said, just rounding it off a little bit more so it doesn't catch somewhere in the cylinder wall on one of the ports. Okay, so at a minimum, if you don't want to get the cheap Harbor Freight Dremel tool and you don't want to mess around with any of that, you need to take the emery and hit all the edges. All right, like I said, I use 320 grit, but for comparison here, the edges I haven't touched. So there's the brand new piston. Look, it's got a ding in it. That's not for me. Emery will take care of that. These edges right here, razor sharp. And then the edges I did hit, obviously they're not going to be perfect. That emery, or that 320 grit, makes a nice, smooth, clean edge to ride inside your cylinder. Look at that. Takes out all the imperfections. Nothing to snag on your ports. And just for comparison, this is a factory piston. And even has, you know, down here, there's no ports, but it's still rubbing on your cylinder wall. That's a razor sharp edge. That's sharp there. Top edge doesn't even have a good bevel on it. So at a minimum, hit it with some sandpaper, some emery. And then the most important part, if you don't even do the emery, you don't do anything to your piston or your cylinder on your rebuild, you have to wash it thoroughly in hot, soapy water. I just use Dawn dish soap. But all of these parts are cast or forged and they have sand in them. I don't care what brand it is, it's gonna have dye sand in it. And all kinds of contaminants are gonna go right into your engine if you don't clean it with hot soapy water first. So wash your stuff before you put it in. All right, just to recap, we knocked out all the sharp edges inside the piston, put a good chamfer on the outside, hit it with some sandpaper emery cloth, 320 grit, and most importantly, we cleaned it with hot soapy water. These pistons started out at 451.3 grams. I wasn't looking to take out a bunch of weight, but want to make sure they're close to even. So 447.4 and 448. That's pretty close. Side note, take your little piece of sandpaper and just touch the edges of your rings before you even start fitting them to check your end gap. A lot of rings, they do a terrible job of knocking that burr off the edge. And not only will that burr eventually fall off and go into your engine, it can catch on ports, scratch things up. It takes like literally 30 seconds to run emery along here and then clean these up before you even start fitting them. Okay, onto the cylinder. Like I said, this is trying to make this as non-specific as possible, but in this case, I'm rebuilding a Polaris Snowmobile engine. If you're just doing a dirt bike or a chainsaw, you know, you may not have exhaust valves, so some of this won't apply. But things you want to look for, check out your cylinder, especially around the exhaust port. If there's any nicks, dings, you can see some scratches up here at the top of the cylinder, but I can't feel those. This is a Nicosil coated cylinder, so with these you are able to take some fine grit sandpaper, emery cloth. Like I said, I usually use that 320, sometimes a 420, and just touch any areas. I didn't do any porting on this. This is already a pretty high performance motor. But what I will do, and I want to point out, it's very important. If you have exhaust valves, you got to clean these out. They get carbon buildup, and it's one of the main reasons that you'll get rings stuck in the ports, because you get carbon that starts to stick out, or a chunk of it'll fall back in, because on a two-stroke, you do get exhaust that is sucked back into the combustion chamber as the piston comes down. So if you have a bunch of carbon buildup in there, it can get sucked in there and then cause issues. Another thing I always do is I take a piece of emery and a die grinder, or a lot of times I'll use a, let me find it here, an actual die grinder like this. And I take a rod, cut a little slit in it, and stick a piece of sandpaper in it so it spins and flaps like a flapper, and get these exhaust ports as smooth as possible. That prevents the carbon from building up in here. Opposite, on your intakes, you want to leave them rough so that your fuel and air, your fuel stays atomized in the air, right? On the exhaust side, you want the opposite. You want this as smooth, shiny as possible, and that's going to prevent, like I said, carbon from building up inside of here and causing problems, especially on these two strokes with variable exhaust valves, because you start getting the exhaust valves to stick, they'll get stuck down in the actual port, it won't operate like they're supposed to, and it just cause issues more so on two cylinders than single, because on the twin cylinder, if you have one that's sticking and one that's not, you'll get different combustion pressures in one side to the other, and it causes even more issues, especially if it's not electronically controlled with detonation sensor. You'll get detonation and end up destroying a piston. But most importantly, as I mentioned with the pistons, whether it's new or you're just rebuilding it, wash it in hot, soapy water. It'll prevent 99% of your problems on the rebuild. Is there's contaminants in here that you can't see, and it's gonna waste all the time you just put into rebuilding it if you're not getting these things clean before you put them back together. All right, enjoy.